Alrighty. Good morning, everyone. Baruchim Haborim. Welcome to Farbindungen 2024. My name is Caleb, and my co-chair, Sophia, Shoulson, and I would like to thank you all for joining us this morning and over the next 2 days for our conversations and panels centering on the theme of Shtumer alef, beginnings, silences, and partnerships. To start, we'd like to extend our gratitude to our keynote speakers, Miryem-Khaye, Seigel and Ayelet Brinn, our panelists, moderators, and workshop facilitators for all their hard work, expertise, and their willingness to share their thoughts with us. We'd also like to thank our host, the Stulman Program in Jewish Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and our faculty advisors, Professors Samuel Spinner and Netta Stahl, for their help and guidance over the last year. And finally, we'd like to extend our truly deepest gratitude and heartfelt thanks to the rest of the organizing committee who have worked so incredibly hard over this last year and without whom none of this would have been possible.
As a conference without a permanent home, Farbindungen is indebted to all individuals and institutions who share space with us. The invitation to share this space often does not come from the land's indigenous stewards. We will continue to reflect on our own complicity as settlers as we live, work, and study on stolen land. This year, the Farbindungen Conference is hosted by the Stulman Jewish Studies program at Johns Hopkins University. We humbly acknowledge that Johns Hopkins University is located on the traditional and contemporary homelands of Indigenous people. Our campus resides on unceded lands of the Piscataway and Susquehannock peoples. We recognize the enduring presence of more than 7,000 Indigenous peoples in Baltimore City, including the Piscataway, Lumbee, and Eastern Band of Cherokee community members. As we gather from places across the country and globe, we honor and recognize Indigenous people of our homelands. Together, we acknowledge the history of genocide and ongoing systemic inequities while respecting treaties made on this territory as a step towards reconciliation and strengthening relationships with Indigenous peoples. We give thanks to the past, present, and future stewards of this land and respect all tribal nations' sovereignty and right to self-determination. We aim to hold ourselves and the university community accountable to tribal nations.
So before we jump right into the keynote panel, just a few quick reminders. If you have are experiencing any difficulties, have any questions, please send an email to farbindungen@gmail.com, especially if you're having trouble connecting to the Zoom or anything like that. We can totally help you out through there. And if you know someone who would like to attend the conference, but they're not yet registered, please do not share the Zoom links with them and instead direct them to the registration form, which can be found on our website, farbindungen.com. This is just a step to make sure that all of our events are safe and secure. Finally, the registration form will remain open throughout the conference, and we'll be processing registrations manually as we go along. And we welcome you during this session, during our keynote session, to use the Q&A function in the webinar to ask questions during our two speakers' presentations, and that way we can collect them as the presentations go along, and we'll have them ready for the audience Q&A at the end.
And now we'd like to turn things over to Joey Reisberg, who will be moderating the keynote panel. Joseph Reisberg grew up in and around Baltimore and attended Goucher College studying history and creative writing. He is now a PhD student at Johns Hopkins University. He was the 2022-2023 Applebaum Family Fellow in Bibliography and Translation at the Yiddish Book Center. His translations have appeared in JewishFiction.net, the Loch Raven Review, and Yiddish in the South. He is currently translating the short stories of Mina Smoller, who writes characters at the margins of society, many non-Jewish, and reveals the hypocrisies of a post-war American society of supposed plenty. Thank you, Joey.
Thank you, Sophia and Caleb, for your introduction and for all the hard work and leadership you've displayed throughout the planning of this conference. I'm so excited to be here with you all today as we explore beginnings, silences, and partnerships. Our brilliant keynote speakers today are Miryem-Khaye Seigel and Ayelet Brinn. Miryem-Khaye Seigel is a Yiddish songwriter, singer, actor, recording artist, and scholar in Yiddish music and culture, who, in the words of the New York Times, exemplifies the attempt to bring a centuries-old language and culture into the contemporary world. She has performed internationally and released a CD called Tausend Tamen, 1,000 Flavors. Miryem-Khaye is co-editor with Elisa Quint of Women on the Yiddish Stage, published by Legenda in 2023, and is a member of the Digital Yiddish Theater Project. She received YIVO's Joseph Kremen Memorial Fellowship for her research project, The Brodersingers, Forerunners of the Yiddish Theater. Please visit her website, memches.com, for more information. And we're also so pleased to welcome Ayelet Brinn, an assistant professor of Judaic Studies and History at the University of Hartford, where she holds the Philip D. Feltman Professorship in Modern Jewish History. Her first book, A Revolution in Type, Gender and the Making of the Yiddish Press, was just released with New York University Press. We are so very grateful to begin this year's conference with two scholars who have much to share about recovering nearly silenced figures from the archive. After we hear from both scholars, I will have a few questions, and then we'll go to an audience Q&A. So feel free to start submitting your questions into the Q&A tab.
So before I start, I just want to say Shalom Aleichem alle, and thank you to the conference team, Caleb, Shmuel, Joel, Joey, Chaim, Molly, Corvin, Sophia, Sorele, and my co-keynote speaker, Ayelet Brinn, for working with me and giving me the chance to speak to you today. I've been in the field of Yiddish for a while now, and I have to say that it's very heartening to see how dynamic it has become and how many exciting things are going on, like this conference. So yasher koyach to all of you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. One sec. So my topic today is the Yiddish theater singer and actor Pepi Littman, a Yiddish drag king of the early 20th century. I'm researching her biography and also thinking about how to frame her life and work. I'd like to start with a quote from Michel Weichert, the Yiddish theater director, historian, critic, and activist. This comes from his 1926 book, Theater und Drama. In the buffet of Kaminsky's theater, and this is probably Avram Kaminsky, the husband of Esther Rochel Kaminska, the mother of the Yiddish theater in Warsaw. Right by the entrance from the right side hangs upon the wall a photographic portrait of a woman in her middle years in masculine clothing with the signature Pepi Littman. Many of today's theater goers are not familiar with this name, and even those who do know it will wonder how the portrait came into a theater. Pepi Littman was not an actress. She rarely performed in a theater, and if she used to show herself once in a while on a larger stage, it was when she had no other alternative. Her actual domain was not the theater, but the hall or garden, not the boards, but the overboards, that is the cabaret stage. Dressed as a chassid, in a velvet hat over curly payas around her round, full woman's face, in a broad, unbuttoned capote, short trousers, white socks, and slippers with both hands under her sidelocks, her payas, or at her sides, she used to shoot out from behind the curtain simultaneously with the song. And in the same moment, she ignited the public like lightning, and everyone in the hall, servant and merchant, tailor and doctor, servant girl and matron, seized upon the melody and sung along with her. She had a masculine voice, deep and hoarse, but whoever heard her yismechu once could never forget it. Pepi Littman was no actress. She did not hold the identification papers of a professional union and did not graduate from any schools, but she possessed more of the Yiddish theater than two of today's professional troupes put together. So there's a lot to think about here. There's her masculine of center gender presentation, her interactive performance style in smaller spaces, her Hasidic flavor, her wild popularity, and her incredible natural charisma. From the first time I heard about Pepi, I was really struck by the strength of her personality and how people have today reclaimed her as a queer icon. Her bold gender nonconformity as a performer is inspiring to many. We don't know if she was queer or what that might even mean, then or now, but there is no doubt that her work has resonance and relevance, especially for those of us in the queer community and allies of the queer community. So I'm thinking about how Farbindungen's theme this year of the Shtumer alef, or silent alef, relates to Pepi. Like the Shtumer alef, queer people have always been around, even when there is a silence around our lives and identities. Shtumer alef, like queerness, is something that we may see but don't necessarily hear, like that uncle with the roommate who was always there, but no one ever used the word gay or said they were a couple. Shtumer alef can also function as a mechitze, between vowels that can't be next to each other. One might even say that in some contexts, Shtumer alef is parav, not milchik and not fleishik, neither milk nor meat. It's abyssal nishtahin, nishtaher, neither here nor there, neither he nor she. So it's somewhat fluid, like gender identity. It's all very queer when you think about it. So there was a silence in that historically we don't really have many words in Yiddish or even concepts to talk about LGBTQ topics, although there are people today putting together vocabulary lists for educators, for example. But when conducting historical research on the queer past in Yiddish history, what keywords can we use in a search, in an index? What kind of things can we discern from the layers of meaning? And if people can assume that everyone was or is straight, why not, to paraphrase Harvey Fierstein, why not the reverse? Another challenge of this research, excuse me, is trying to write a biography of someone when we don't even have anything in their own voice. Peppy apparently never wrote a memoir. I don't know of any articles that she wrote about her acting craft or her background. Her own daughter wrote that she was a verschwiegte Frau, a reticent woman. We don't know how artists like Peppy felt or how they identified regarding gender identity and sexual orientation, and we can't ask them, but we can still take inspiration from them. So I will briefly try to cover Peppy's biography while also placing it in context and thinking about these questions. So just to advance my slide for a moment. So Peppy Littman was a Yiddish singer and actress who focused mainly or exclusively on drag roles. She lived between 1874, 1876, and 1930, and she's recently been reclaimed as a queer icon. And there are a number of projects devoted to her. There is the Peppy Littman Project by Jeanette Levitsky. There was a play and also a film. So these are all projects that have emerged in the last few years inspired by Peppy. So in order to first, they say in Yiddish, before I start speaking, I want to say a few words. I actually want to talk a little bit about the history of drag in the Yiddish theater in order to put her work into context. So in terms of the Yiddish theater, there's actually a long history of drag. If you're interested in seeing the timeline of Yiddish drag, you can check that out on the Digital Yiddish Theater Project website. So basically, there were the Broder Singers, which predated the actual Yiddish theater. This was an all-male group that emerged in the mid-1850s, and this was the first group of secular Yiddish performers. So instead of performing in religiously prescribed environments, like, for example, a Purim or a Badchen at a wedding, they performed in a secular setting, like a tavern or a wine garden, and their repertoire was really quite primitive. It was songs, it was skits. They didn't really have much in the way of costumes or makeup. So, and these early secular Yiddish performers, the Broder Singers, they performed male and female roles, the latter in drag. The repertoire was comic, but also tragic, and they often mixed spoken dialogues with songs. They were influenced by Hasidism and by the clash between Hasidism and modernity. So Pesha Kahana was born, Peppy Littman was born as Pesha Kahana in Tarnopol, Galicia in 1874, 1876. So she was really born when this Broder Singer movement was still pretty early, and also around the time that Avram Goldfaden officially founded the Yiddish theater. So basically, what did that mean? That meant that not just these skits and songs, but actually full-fledged plays and operettas. And initially, it was all men. But they were a lot of the personnel from the Broder Singers, actually, but audiences immediately clamored for cisgender women to join. So basically, that happened soon after the Yiddish theater was officially founded. And this broke the traditional Jewish religious prohibition of kol ba'isha, which forbade women from singing or performing in public. So the Yiddish theater provided some opportunities for women, especially for women that were married to men, although it was not equitable. Acting was not considered a respectable profession. And for women especially, it was considered akin to sex work. You can read more about this in the Introduction to Women on the Yiddish Stage, which is a book that I co-edited with Elisa Quint, which was just published. So many people had to run away from home in order to perform in the Yiddish theater. And actually, some men continued performing in drag even after women joined. So Peppy was really born and came of age in this environment. So as I said, she was born as Pesha Kahana in Tarnopol, Galicia. And we don't know that much about her early life. We know that she was poor and possibly orphaned at an early age, and she may have gone to Romania to work. Zalman Zilbertzweig, the great Yiddish theater biographer, writes that possessing a beautiful voice, she was recruited by the Broder singers to perform with them in taverns and inns and to wander with them over Galicia and Romania. So, and she married the director and musician Yankov Littman in Czernowitz, and they had one daughter, Lena, who was born in 1903. So consider how women were treated then, how it would have been for her to travel and work and do business as a single woman without being with a male family member like a husband or a father. It could have been a marriage of convenience, a lavender marriage, a love marriage. We don't know. But one thing that is interesting is that Pepi was and is much more famous than her first husband, Yankov. According to Jacob Mestel, it was not just that she was a star, but it was actually her and not her husband that was the head of her vaudeville troupe. She was also the first to engage foreign language female singers and actresses in her ensemble, depending on local demands. So that could be German, Polish, Hungarian, and so on. So what about her drag career? Well, I have to say that first, as I mentioned before, drag was not a new thing. Here you can see some examples of men performing in drag, and I apologize for my language if it's rather limited. I'm kind of using the terminology that was used at the time, but please forgive me if I misrepresent somebody's gender identity or don't use the correct terms. I'm learning along with you, so I hope that this will be interesting for you. So you have some examples of men that played these drag roles in the Yiddish theater. Herman Weinberg on the left-hand side performed as Breine and continued to perform these roles even after women joined. Boris Tomaszewski famously filled in for an absent prima donna. There's also a role of Die Bobbe in Die Bobbe mit den Enekel, the grandmother and the granddaughter that was performed by Zygmunt Turkov. Traditionally, that role is performed by a man. There's also women that performed in drag. Sophia Karp was probably the first Yiddish actress. Before she joined the troupe, it was actually her husband that performed the young female roles. And she actually had to marry him in order to start her career on the Yiddish theater because her mother wouldn't let her perform while she was in her house. So she basically had to marry the only single guy in order to get a job. Also, Salche Weisenfreund, who's pictured in the center here, also performed as a tailor in pants with the Broder singers around 1890. And then also Bessie Tomaszewski performed as the Grüne Brocher, the young, sort of the green or naive bachelor, which is a role that Pepi also played. So what do we know about her drag career? Well, I talked a little bit about her early life. So sorry, these slides are a little bit out of order, but we don't know a lot about her early life, and we actually don't know when exactly or why or how she started performing in drag. We just know that it kind of became her thing. And again, I had referenced the book, Women on the Yiddish Stage, which goes into some detail about women emerging as Yiddish actors, as directors, as translators, choreographers, etc. And there's a number of scholarly essays in here, but also the introduction by Elisa Quint provides some context. So we don't know that much about her early career or how or why she started doing drag. The actor Boaz Young writes that Pepi Littman was a beautiful and plump woman with a pair of dark eyes, and what a voice she had, an extraordinarily strong alto. She only performed boys. So we know that she became wildly popular. Here you see her dressed in traditional religious garb. On the other side is a page from Shirei Zimro, which was Beryl Broder's book. Beryl Broder was one of the first, some believe the founder of the Broder singers, these secular Yiddish performers, and some believe that he founded it. And he was actually one of the only people from that group that published his work in print form. So this is the title page of his book. So we know that she became really popular and that Jews and non-Jews would sing her material. She sang coupletten, couplets, and satirical material, often dressed as a chassid. She also sang more serious material, and her domain was the cabaret stage, cafes, wine gardens, less so the large theaters. She even performed in German health spas. She was also very popular in Hungary among the non-Jewish theater audience, and they gave her the nickname Die Pepitze. By the time she was in her 20s, maybe even earlier, she was something of a celebrity, and not only in Galicia and Romania, but also in cities like Warsaw, Budapest, Vienna, Berlin, Czernowitz, Prague, and beyond. For example, one of the earliest articles I found about her work appeared in an intriguing newspaper called Ost und West that represented a German Jewish perspective about Eastern European Jews. So I'm going to paraphrase a little bit from this review. The Yiddish theater in Lemberg is largely patronized by the local poor Jewish community. The critic is not too impressed by the first half of the performance or by the dingy atmosphere, but he was surprised to see a bold young man in a long robe, white socks, and carefully curled payas show up on stage, Happy Litman. All she has to do is say one word, make one gesture, and the public laughs. Her wit, her jokes, her interactions with the audience. She's inventive and smart. Her songs are popular, and they sing with her. So we know, too, that in addition to performing all over Eastern and Western Europe, for example, she was in Vienna in 1903 with this Lemberger Singspiel Ensemble. I also, if I didn't mention before, Lemberg or Lviv, Ukraine today was a center of Yiddish theater, partly because of Gimpel's theater, which was founded in 1889 there. It really was a center for not just for theater, but also for cabaret types of acts. And this was really the place to be for that type of repertoire. So this is an example of an advertisement in the Vienna newspaper, actually, for a performance of a group from Lemberg. And so this was really popular at the time in this area. She also came to New York City in 1906. So here's an advertisement for a performance at the Clinton Vaudeville Hall. And the proprietor or the impresario was Sam Agid, who organized a lot of vaudeville performances. She also performed, kind of funny, as someone pointed out, for the Pants Makers for the 1st of May. And they managed to grab her before she went off to Europe. So apparently she was in New York City for about 2 years. And she had some family here. We're still trying to trace them down. But she made some commercial recordings in New York and also in a lot of other places. She actually made dozens of recordings. Sometimes she recorded the same song twice for different record labels. It's quite extensive. Here are just a few examples of some of her recordings. And I'm making a list of all of those to try to get a sense of where she was, who she was recording for. I wish I had time to play her material. I don't, but there's a lot of great stuff online. Even if you go to YouTube, you can find a lot of her recordings, so I won't spend time on that. But I will say that her songs are characterized by a strong Galicianer accent and lots of innuendo. Often she sings in the role of a chassid, a Hasidic man, for example, coming home to his wife on Shabbos for a nice meal, or about the joy of the Sabbath. She was known for Yismechu, or about a fanatic who believes that when the Messiah comes, the heretics will be punished. We can surmise she was probably from a Hasidic background or had at least been heavily exposed to Hasidism. And she was known for being a comedian, but she also sang more serious material, for example, decrying materialism and greed, upholding nationalistic themes, and bemoaning the suffering of the Jews. Some of her repertoire came from specific plays, and some of it was even popular tearjerkers of the time. But really the highlight of her career seems to be from the early 20th century through about the First World War. So we know, in terms of trying to trace some of her roles and careers, we know that she performed in the role Das Freiliche Bocherl, which it's hard not to interpret that as the happy or gay little guy at Kaminsky's Theater in Warsaw. And here's a picture of her with, I believe that is Rosa Green, in the play Itzig will Chasen haben, which actually was published as a play. It was based on another play, and I'm going to read that because I'm so intrigued to know what the play is about. But apparently she absolutely took the local theater by storm. So that was one of her pieces. Let's see. We also know that she was in Odessa in 1915. So she actually, I was able to find some images, thanks to a colleague, of the actual theater where she performed as Freiliche Bocherl. And at this time, she was working in the troupe of Laser Rappel, who was a theater director. And we know that this was actually published in the newspaper Unser Leben. And we know too that during World War I, thanks to the memoirs of Zina Rappel, who was an actress and the wife of Laser Rappel, we know that Pepi was part of a troupe that was actually forced to perform by armed gangs, like in the middle of the war and all the bombing. So that was a very dramatic episode. We know too that she spent some time in Romania around this time and also in the Soviet Union. And there's some inconsistencies about when her first husband, Yankov, actually died and when she remarried to Lazar Olshansky. We know too that she spent a considerable amount of time in the Soviet Union, especially during the First World War and after, and she kind of disappears from some of the sources, at least as far as I can tell, until about the mid-1920s. So we know that she returned to Warsaw. She performed some of her repertoire again. At this time, when Weger was writing about her, she was not as well known. By that time, I think the Broder singers were considered sort of out of style by then. She was also getting to be a little bit older, so maybe she wasn't as well known at that time. It's something that happens to actors, especially women, that when they reach a certain age, people don't see them as relevant. So that could have definitely played into it. So we do have some other records of her performing in Gehenim in Warsaw, and again, being extremely popular. This was in 1930 in the Moment newspaper. But we do know that she became ill, and this was partly caused by the Great Depression because she had a large fortune amassed that she planned to spend on her daughter's wedding, but she unfortunately lost it in the stock market crash. And she was very depressed about this, and it contributed to the downfall of her health. And unfortunately, she became sick, and she was in a community hospital, the Rothschild Hospital in Vienna, and died there September 13th of 1930. And here are some obituaries that appeared in various papers in the Vorwärts and in the Moment. Again, there were different accounts of her life and conflicting information. Her daughter even wrote in to the paper to try to correct some of those. But sadly, they say that she was gestorben in fremde Tachrichim. She was buried in strangers' shrouds. The actors in Vienna took up a collection to pay for her funeral. And the funeral was organized by the Vienna Union of Jewish Actors, and the community gave her a funeral plot, which I'm still trying to find. And then in January of 1933, there was a ceremony for the unveiling of her gravestone, and it was attended by at least 100 people. And it was officiated by a cantor, from the Leopoldstadter Temple. So it was quite a big event, and it appeared in the local newspaper. So just to conclude, I just want to give one more short quote from Yankov Mestel. He said that Littman was almost the only characteristically Jewish chansonetke in Hasidic trousers. And when she came onto the stage as a chassid, every nerve of hers would flicker. Her deep, slightly heavy alto used to caress like a soft cello. With her charming vulgarity, she used to ignite the audience. So there's a lot to think about here. What strikes me the most is that she was considered attractive and popular as a performer because she was bold, plump, gender nonconforming, and even vulgar. She was actually known for being vulgar, not despite these characteristics, but because of them. She really found her strength as a performer doing these drag roles and became known for them. I can't answer questions like why she did drag, how she identified, or if she was queer, but I can say that we can learn a lot from her work and its context, and that she's powerfully inspiring. Ashenim Dank.
Thank you so much, Miryem-Khaye. Let's do a virtual round of applause for that brilliant presentation. And Pepi's charisma still shines through after all these decades, so thank you so much. Just a reminder, please keep putting your questions in the chat directed towards either one of our presenters or to both, and we'll have a conversation afterward. So next, Ayelet, if you're ready, we'll hear from you.
Okay. So I wanted to start by thanking the organizers of the conference for inviting me to give this talk, and Miryem-Khaye for being in conversation with me today. As many of you probably know, Miryem-Khaye is such a generous colleague, as well as being a brilliant scholar and artist, so I'm really honored to be presenting alongside her. And there's so much interesting resonance between our talks today, so I'm excited for the conversation part as well. So given the topic of this conference, I decided to focus during my time today on some methodological questions related to gender and archival trails that I explored while researching my book, A Revolution in Type, which came out a couple months ago. Among other things, the book describes the various roles that women writers and women readers played in the development of the American Yiddish press. And it explores what a focus on the experiences of female readers and writers, debates by editors about female readers and writers, and content supposedly aimed at a female audience, like advice columns or women's columns, which were in reality read and enjoyed by many regardless of gender. What all of these things can tell us about the overlap and contradictions between the political, commercial, and cultural priorities of the American Yiddish press, and about the process through which the Yiddish press in America developed from very unpromising origins to becoming an absolutely central political and cultural institution. So throughout its period of peak influence, the production end of American Yiddish newspapers was in many ways a male-dominated sphere. The vast majority of content within these newspapers was written by men, and it was very rare for women to hold editorial positions, though there were a handful of female editors at various times, at various papers, but they were mainly appointed to edit the newspaper's women's pages. Most women who contributed to the Yiddish press worked freelance, as opposed to having full-time staff positions, which would have afforded them more job stability and higher wages. And in addition, women often dealt with male editors and publishers who had very specific expectations of what women could or should write in their publications. And they often limited women to writing about, I guess, supposedly feminine topics such as romance or housekeeping, or writing in ways that emphasize women's sentimentality or naivete. Even within these constraints, women writers produced a rich corpus of work, but many female writers expressed their frustrations at the limits of what they, as women, were able to contribute to the American Yiddish press. So for all of these reasons, writing by and the experiences of male journalists and editors are often centered in histories of the American Yiddish press. But throughout the history of the Yiddish press in America, there were always women contributing to these publications in various ways. At first, many of these contributions were behind the scenes, with women serving as translators, secretaries, or bookkeepers. But by the 1910s, all of the major American Yiddish dailies across the ideological spectrum were increasingly interested in courting the attention of female readers, which was both a part of a general strategy attempting to diversify the audience of Yiddish newspapers, and an attempt to make sure that more advertisers advertised their wares in the Yiddish press, because many advertisers assumed women were the ones buying products for their household. So these efforts to attract women readers culminated in the introduction of specifically labeled women's pages, or sometimes half-page women's sections, in most major Yiddish dailies beginning in the mid-1910s. So the introduction of these pages led to the inclusion of more writing by women in the Yiddish press, as editors assumed women would be able to write the types of content women readers wanted to read. Even with this, it's important to note again that 1, men were often eager readers of women's pages in the Yiddish press. 2, women readers never necessarily limited their reading to just the sections of the paper explicitly labeled for women. 3, women writers only contributed some, not all of the material on women's pages in the Yiddish press. And 4, women's writing was also featured sometimes in other sections of the newspaper, especially poetry or serialized fiction. So even though their roles were constrained or not always acknowledged, there were women working behind the scenes and in print throughout the history of the Yiddish press, and their contributions were crucial in many ways to the day-to-day functioning of these publications, as well as to newspapers' powers as political and cultural institutions. In addition, these women's experiences and their writing offer a corrective to male-centric narratives of the history of the Yiddish press by asking us to think about what kinds of work are considered most valuable and whose work has been accounted for or not accounted for in the histories of the Yiddish press. So in the past several decades, scholars have been exploring the various ways that women have contributed to the development of Yiddish culture in America, Europe, and other locations, especially a rich legacy of women's creative writing in Yiddish. But today I want to build on this tradition by focusing on a different set of contributions that women made to the development of Yiddish culture in general and the Yiddish press in America in specific, which is the roles that women played behind the scenes at various Yiddish newspapers, especially as translators, secretaries, and writers of anonymous content. These contributions didn't come with bylines, and they probably were not always recognized by readers at the time that they were published. And they're also not usually accounted for in histories of the Yiddish press. And it's only through supplementing Yiddish newspapers with a variety of archival and memoir sources that we can begin to account for the roles that women performed in helping newspapers become such powerful institutions. So for the rest of my time today, I want to focus on a couple of examples of where and how I found women working behind the scenes on the production side of Yiddish newspapers. And since our time together is short, this is not meant to be exhaustive in any way. I just want to use a few examples to illustrate some broader patterns. And then at the end, I'll open up to explore some of the challenges I faced when conducting this research and some takeaways about how centering the experiences of women changes our understanding of the history of the American Yiddish press. So I'm going to focus particularly today on translation, because that's one area where women appeared quite often in my research. So translation was always an integral component in the composition of American Yiddish newspapers. They often included articles and literature that were originally published in languages like English, Hebrew, Russian, and German. And this reliance on translation was in part an ideological decision. Editors and publishers wanted to introduce their readers to a broad range of discourses. But in many cases, it was also a very practical decision. Throughout their runs, but especially in their first years of existence, Yiddish newspapers were very underfunded and short-staffed. So translating materials from other print venues, often without acknowledgement or sometimes with not full acknowledgement, became a way to actually just fill newspapers with content. And they didn't necessarily always care whether the content of this translated material actually fit the ideological line of the newspaper. I'm happy to give examples later if people are interested. So women were never the only ones translating articles or novels from other languages for inclusion in the Yiddish press, but each major Yiddish newspaper did employ women to do this translation work throughout their runs. And I have some examples here on the screen, including Adela Keen-Zemetkin, who contributed translations to publications like the Orthodox Tageblatt and the Socialist Abendblatt, Miriam Schomer-Zinzer, who also worked at the Tageblatt, Rachel Holtman, who was at the Communist Freiheit, as well as various other smaller weeklies and monthlies, and Anna Kahan, who contributed translations to the Forward. So some of these translations ran with attributions either to the original author of the material or the translator, or sometimes both. So sometimes scanning through the pages of newspapers allows us some sense of the roles that women were performing, especially in the early years of the Yiddish press when there were very, very few original articles by women. So this, for example, on your screen, is a translation from French by Adela Keen, also known by her married name, Adela Keen-Zemetkin, that ran in the Abendblatt in 1894. So this particular translation did not list the original author, just the translator. But much of the translated material within the Yiddish press ran without acknowledgement of who is actually doing the translating. So we only know about women's contributions through memoirs or archival sources. So one good example of this broader phenomenon is Rosa Lebensboim, who's much better known in literary history for her poetry, which she wrote under the pseudonym Anna Margolin. But for most of her life, she made her living by working as a journalist, mainly writing, translating, and editing for the Yiddish daily Der Tag. Because of Lebensboim's fame as a poet, many of her acquaintances kept letters to or from her, or wrote about her in their memoirs, which allows us to paint a broader picture of her work than bylines alone would allow. But sort of like Miryem-Khaye was saying, a lot of these things are not in her voice, so it's sometimes hard to pick apart what other people were saying about her versus what her actual experiences were. So unlike most American Yiddish newspapers, the Tag actually kept its payrolls, so we have some sense of what she was doing. But in addition to that, we also have letters. So in letters from 1923, Lebensboim described translating stories for the Tag by writer Osip Dimov. Dimov wrote in Russian and Yiddish, But in this phase of his career, apparently editors didn't think his Yiddish language skills were fluid enough to be fit to print. So Lebensboim would translate the Russian versions for Yiddish, but they ran without her attribution anywhere. And so on these payrolls, you also get some sense of her working as a translator on weeks where translations were not attributed to her on the pages of the newspaper. In addition, the spelling of her name changed in different payrolls, and sometimes she's referred to as Mrs. Gordon, which was her married name. So it's only by piecing together these payrolls, her biographical details, and various other sources that we can sort of begin to reconstruct her behind-the-scenes contributions to this newspaper. So the fact that there were women like Rosa Lebensboim and others working behind the scenes at the Yiddish press as translators reflects a couple of important aspects of the development of the Yiddish press. So first, it gives us a sense of the hierarchy of work that was performed in the composition of Yiddish newspapers, because women were often tasked with the less prestigious types of work. So again, translation was always a critical component of the Yiddish press, and of course requires significant skill linguistically and also literarily. But writers and editors did not always see translations as the most prestigious kind of work in newspapers. They saw things like writing editorials or highbrow literature as a more prestigious form of writing. So this meant that there was more space for women to fill these roles than there might have been if translation were given its proper due. Second, it also highlights the ways in which educational practices in many Ashkenazi Jewish communities varied by gender. And this was especially true in Eastern Europe, where many of these women had been born. So in middle-class Maskilic households, it was much more common for young women to learn languages like Russian or French or German than their brothers or male cousins. Literary scholar Iris Parouche has noted that this allowed women more access to secular non-Jewish literature than their male counterparts. But then in the context of the American Yiddish press, it also helps us to explain why women were hired as translators, because many of these women had educations in both Yiddish and non-Jewish languages that they could employ in their translation work. Third, it also highlights the difficulties that many women faced in trying to contribute to the Yiddish press. In many cases, it was only possible to forge stable or even somewhat stable careers in Yiddish journalism if you had some sort of connection to a prominent male editor, writer, or publisher. So all four of the translators listed on this slide were the wives or daughters of famous male writers and editors. So Adela Keen-Zemetkin was the wife of Michal Zemetkin, who was a one-time editor of The Forward. Miriam Shomer Zunzer was the daughter of noted fiction writer Shtumer. Rachel Holtman was the wife of writer and editor Moshe Holtman, and Anna Kahan was the wife of the Forward's longtime editor, Abraham Kahn. So I'm bringing up their connections to these prominent men because it gives us a sense of the fact that the world of the Yiddish press was often closed to women without some sort of personal connection. This was obviously not just true of the Yiddish press, it was also true of Jewish journalism in other languages and often non-Jewish journalism as well. Being the child or romantic partner of a prominent male often allowed women much more ease of access to publication. And I'm saying this not to call these women's talent into question, but instead to raise questions about whether there were other women who would have wanted to contribute to the Yiddish press, but who weren't able to because of lack of access. Also, it shows how precarious these inroads were. If a woman were to fall out with her parents or with her romantic partner, they would often lose their position on a newspaper as well. So sometimes husbands and wives or partners worked individually, but in some cases, which I find particularly interesting, couples actually worked together to produce their translations. So one of my favorite examples of this is the husband and wife pair of Leon Kobrin and Paula or Polina Seigel-Kobrin. Leon Kobrin was a prolific writer and playwright, and his name and contributions to Yiddish culture are much more well-known than his wife's today. But throughout their careers, they often worked together, collaborating especially on translations, many of which ended up being published only under his name. Also, which is particularly interesting, the reasons they chose to collaborate and the meaning that they and others infused into this partnership changed significantly over time. So in the early years of their marriage, in addition to both writing various content in their own names or under pseudonyms, the Kobrins collaborated on translation projects because her linguistic skills were much better than his. So like many young radical men in Eastern Europe, Leon Kobrin was not really reading or writing in Yiddish. By the time he came to America, he preferred to express himself in Russian. But when he came to the United States, he and other radical young men realized the power of Yiddish as a language through which to connect with working-class Jewish immigrants who were coming to America at this time. So when he began writing in Yiddish, he decided that it was a sort of ideological commitment, but his Yiddish linguistic skills were not wonderful. Paulina's Yiddish, in contrast, was much more fluid, and she was also fluent in several other languages. So in his memoir, Leon-Khaye Brinn described collaborating with his wife early on in his writing career, not just as an enjoyable experience, which it was, they seemed to work very well together, but also as a linguistic necessity so that these translations were clear and accurate. So over time, Leon-Khaye Brinn's Yiddish language skills improved, and he made a name for himself as a playwright and a writer of fiction. But by this point in their marriage, they had reached what their son Nathan-Khaye Brinn later called, quote, an unwritten understanding that mother would help translate materials so that father would have more time to create dramatic works for the Yiddish stage, end quote. So Nathan's memories about his parents' partnership convey some sense of hierarchy of literary work within the family, wherein Leon's more quote unquote creative dramatic output took precedence over translation projects. But at the same time, these recollections also evoke a sense of partnership and shared activity, with both Khaye-Brinns viewing their creative enterprises as in some way shared labor. In some cases, this was actual collaboration, but in others, it was finding ways to facilitate their partner's work by supplementing it. So according to Nathan, the times when both of his parents were working on literary endeavors were, quote, probably the happiest times in their marriage, end quote, because this partnership allowed them a sense of financial stability, which obviously was important, but also a sense of shared intellectual fulfillment. So throughout his career, Leon-Khaye Brinn published many translations, much of which was either produced in reality in collaboration with his wife or by his wife and signed with his name so that he could devote his time to other ventures. This fact was also corroborated by one of Leon-Khaye Brinn's editors, the Tog's B.Z. Goldberg, who once wrote that he often noticed that translations that were supposedly submitted to the paper by Leon-Khaye Brinn were actually in his wife's handwriting. However, when these translations were published, either within the Yiddish press or in book form, they often appeared with only Leon-Khaye Brinn's name attached. So one account that I read of this dynamic asserted that this choice was not the decision of the Khaye Brinns, but was the decision of the editors of the publications that the Khaye Brinns worked for. Because Leon-Khaye Brinn was, by this point, a relatively prominent figure in Yiddish culture, editors felt that translations that ran under his name, as opposed to her name or their names together, would be more marketable. So they took her name off of these pieces before publishing them. So to correct this narrative, Leon-Khaye Brinn included a list of some of their collaborations in his memoirs. But just by looking at the newspapers themselves, we wouldn't have gotten a sense of how Paulina Seigel-Khaye Brinn's full contributions to the Yiddish press had been erased by male editors who wanted to use her husband's fame to sell their publications. So examples like Paulina Seigel-Khaye Brinn and Rosa Lebensboim show how crucial women's skills as translators were to the development of the American Yiddish press, but also the fact that editors and publishers did not always publicly attribute this translation work to the women who performed it. So this was not only true of translation. There were also women who contributed other forms of content to the Yiddish press, sometimes anonymous content like news blurbs or editorials. In other cases, the female secretaries employed by newspapers were tasked with corresponding with the thousands of newspaper readers who wrote letters to these publications every year. Sometimes they asked newspapers to provide more personal or private advice than they could find in newspapers' advice columns. Much of these letters assumed that they would be corresponding with male editors of the publication and address their letters to a male sort of interlocutor. But in practice, it was often the secretaries of these male figures who actually responded to these letters, and some of these secretaries were women. So the institutional archive of the Tog at YIVO houses just this amazing treasure trove of hundreds of unpublished letters from readers from the 1920s and 30s. And basically all of them are responded to by one woman, Helen Atkins, who was the Tog's editorial secretary. So she was tasked with conducting the research that was necessary to answer readers' letters and then connect them with whatever resources or information they needed. So in serving as the paper's editorial secretary, she actually facilitated the close personal connection that newspapers hope to create with their readers. So in my talk today, I wanted to provide you with a few examples of some of the women whose lives and experiences I explored in my research, who worked behind the scenes at the prominent American Yiddish newspapers that were so central to Jewish culture at the turn of the 20th century. By working as secretaries, translators, writers of anonymous content, these women performed many functions that were crucial to ensuring that Yiddish newspapers came out every day, and were crucial to ensuring these newspapers would become such crucial lifelines and sources of entertainment, news, and guidance for hundreds of thousands of readers. But because much of this work was not given attribution on the pages of newspapers, we need to supplement with other sources to gain a broader understanding of what women contributed to the development of the Yiddish press. So these sources, the external sources, are pretty spotty and intermittent, so we may never be able to capture the full history of women's contributions to the Yiddish press. This difficulty is supplemented by the fact that women writers who worked in Yiddish are less likely to be included in biographical dictionaries and lexicons than male figures. So it's often hard to trace biographical information about women's names that I did find in my research. In addition, it was also quite common for male writers and editors to write content under female pseudonyms, which again means that we need to interrogate bylines as a source for understanding women's contributions. And I also found at least one instance of a payroll listing a female pseudonym of a male author as if it were an actual contributor to the newspaper, meaning both that this one newspaper was not necessarily aware that this particular author was not a woman, and that even these behind-the-scenes sources need to be read against the grain in order to give us accurate information about the history of the Yiddish press. So even with all of these limitations, even though they're important, by centering the experiences of women writers, translators, administrative workers, and readers, it becomes easier to see the variety of work that went into the day-to-day operations of Yiddish newspapers, not all of which has been given proper credit. Prominent male writers and editors often emphasize sort of the editorial or literary criticism as the most important sections of the newspaper, even if readers were often just as drawn to other sections of the paper. Sources by these male writers often discount the political import or cultural power of these supposedly less important, more entertaining features. But they were actually not only beloved by readers, but were often politically rich and crucial to building a sense of connection between newspapers and readers. And in addition, these narratives discount the variety of types of labor that went into the creation of Yiddish newspapers behind the scenes. So centering the experiences of women allows us a fuller picture of how and why the Yiddish press became such a powerful force in American Jewish life, as well as the actual labor that went into producing these incredibly valuable publications and cultural institutions. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Ayelet. That was absolutely fantastic. And to our audience, you now have 2 new books to add to, I'm sure you're already very full lists. A Revolution in Type by Ayelet Brinn, and Women on the Yiddish Stage, co-edited by Miryem-Khaye Seigel and Elisa Quint. So a virtual round of applause again to both of our amazing speakers for their incredible talks. So much to dive into and explore. We already have a few good questions in the Q&A box, but now is the time to continue asking those questions. Now will be about 15 minutes of moderated convo before we go to the audience Q&A. First, I would like to start with a question for both Miryem-Khaye and Ayelet. So in recent decades, many more people, it seems, have devoted their attention to women's voices and queer narratives in Yiddish studies. Thanks to the efforts of countless researchers, it seems we're finally moving past a scarcity narrative that seemed to dominate the conversation before, and we're beginning to have a more expansive view of Yiddish studies. With this in mind, what are some hopes, fears, or advice you have for younger Yiddish scholars, many of whom may be in the Zoom room, who are starting out at this very generative moment for the field?
Do you want to start? Do you want me to start?
You can start. Oh, yeah.
Okay, sure. I guess 2 quick pieces of advice, and I'm happy to expand on both of them, is a thing that I was counseled when I was starting this research is that there are a lot of truisms related to gender in the scholarship on Yiddish studies that deserve interrogation, and that digging deeper is often rewarded. So one is that women only wrote in certain genres, for example, and often they were writing in certain genres, but there are many ways to expand that out. If you read sources against the grain, if you ask new questions, so there's a lot of room to explore. And don't be sort of discouraged by the fact that there are certain narratives in the history of Yiddish culture that make it seem like you will not find sources. The second is that I work in the fields of Yiddish studies and American Jewish history and gender studies, and we're lucky enough to be in fields where people are very generous with their time and their resources. And I think that is something not to be taken lightly. So I'm going to give one example because she happens to be on screen with me, but very early on in this project, I would say probably about, 10 years ago, I was working at the New York Public Library and we started talking. And Miryem-Khaye shared this unbelievable database that she had put together called Farbindungen, which just gave a list of women who she had found in her research and had been found by other researchers in collaboration, and any sources that have biographical information about them, which is unbelievable and so generous, and is sort of the spirit in which many of us are being trained now, and I think is a pretty magical thing for the history, for the future of Yiddish studies going forward. I'll stop there, I guess.
Well, thank you so much. I'm excited that you used the list, and I really enjoyed your talk a lot, and I learned a lot. And it's interesting because in terms of my research, compiling that list, sometimes it's hard to find information about, especially women writers that wrote not entire monographs, but wrote for the press, because they don't always appear in, a lexicon, and you can't always find as much about them. And especially like back then, the technology has changed a lot, because when you were initially doing your research, you were just looking through microfilms. You couldn't just go to a database and browse digitally or do a keyword search. So the technology has changed a lot.
Yes.
But I think too, having these kinds of bibliographic tools, like for me personally, compiling this list of women who wrote in Yiddish, I amassed more than 865 names. So you think, oh, there weren't that many women, like they weren't well represented. But when you gather all that information together, you can see a lot. And you think about how people's opportunities were impacted by the society they were living in and what they had access to, how much time, how much money they had, what they were able to do. And then you start to see that even though, there are these figures that are more obscure, they really accomplished amazing things. And if you dig a little bit deeper and if you read their work with a more critical eye, you can actually get a lot out of it.
Thank you both. It's really heartwarming to hear about these collaborations. I feel there's so many moments of these serendipities that happen in Yiddish studies, it being a relatively small field. So I'm going to kind of go a little bit out of the order I just said I would, but it's because one of these questions I feel really touches on these themes. So a question from Carolyn Beard: as scholars uncovering the histories of understudied women, how do you negotiate the limits of the conclusions that you can draw through your research?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm just jumping in, if that's okay. I have a lot of thoughts about this. I think I'm a historian, so I try to keep it very sort of, in terms of the methodology, I try to keep it very specific. The people who I can find sources about, I say things about them, and I try to figure out, based on the sources I have, how much this can tell us about broader patterns. And you can't always tell much. And also the sources we have about many of these women, especially the ones who we do have sources about, are complicated. All sources are complicated and have to be read against the grain in a variety of ways, but many of them about these particular women are very complicated. So a good example that I was thinking about my research about Rosa Lebensboim a lot during your talk, Miryem-Khaye, which is what we have in her voice versus in other people's voice, and also the kinds of sources we have. So a lot of the information that I have with which to recount her experiences working behind the scenes for newspapers are love letters to her various lovers that have very private information that I'm not sure that she would have wanted shared. And other people donated these letters. She didn't donate these letters. And so I have to think very critically and carefully about how I am relating to these letters. But also they're the only sources we have to talk about her work life, because when you're talking to your lover in a letter, you're talking about sort of your feelings, but you're also like, oh, I had such an annoying experience with my editor today. And so that's the only way we know that she was in the office that day and doing this translation. So for me, it's about sort of trying to figure out the specifics of the nuance of reconstructing the lives we can reconstruct. And often they'll sort of offhand talk about like the 5 secretaries they had lunch with. And that's the only way we know that there were 5 secretaries, for example. And then not saying that this will tell us everything, because it can't. And I think that's true.
That's great. I would just add to that. For me, also, I mean, I'm not exactly a historian. I'm sort of interdisciplinary in a lot of ways, but for me, putting together a timeline is very helpful. Just collecting information, trying to make sort of an outline of someone's life. And then in the terms of artists, thinking about a timeline of the plays they were in, and especially with Pepi Littman, the recordings that she made, which is really, these are amazing primary sources, and they are literally in her voice, but we think like this was her choice of this repertoire, and this was her choice to perform in a certain way, and this is how she wanted to represent herself. So this is what we get from her more than 100 years later. So those kinds of sources are very important. Also for me, it's, Ayelet mentioned asking questions. So definitely asking questions and being open-minded and realizing that maybe we'll just have to ask questions rather than answering them, but it does give us something to think about and to think, well, we can't just assume, you know, things we might have assumed in the past, like that gender was the binary, or that people use certain pronouns, or that they identified in a certain way, because the circumstances were different and people didn't have the same concepts that we have now. So just trying to be open-minded about it, but at the same time realizing, hey, this is something from our past that we can celebrate and we can get something interesting out of it.
Thank you so much for that. On a related note, I have a question for Miryem-Khaye. What does looking at queer history, specifically in a performance or theatrical context, teach us? And are there specificities if we're looking at the Jewish theater world?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, in a way, for me, it just means asking questions and not making assumptions. I mean, we can say, oh, well, back then, like, nobody was out. It was before Stonewall. It was before there was like a gay liberation movement. So like, for a lot of us in the queer community, it sounds like, oh, so you're saying that we didn't exist until that time, that there's no representation. But actually there is. You just have to sort of dig deeper, and you have to interpret things in a different way. And you can't just assume, well, for example, just because Pepi was married to men twice, like, does that mean that we should say that she was straight? We don't know what her gender identity was. Her presentation was considered attractive by all people, including presumably straight men. So that's also interesting, this idea of gender transgression. So that's one way to look at it. Also looking at the long history of drag. You know, you could argue that, oh, it was just this done out of necessity in the past because it was an all-male group. And certainly there are other cultural traditions that did that as well. But you could also say, well, what about the men that continued to perform these roles even after women joined? And we don't know how they felt when they were doing it, or how they identified, or what they got out of it. But that's also something like very interesting to think about. So I would say we kind of have to look where we can, and we have to just ask a lot of questions and not assume that everybody was straight just because we don't see an overt representation of being queer.
Absolutely, yeah. So a question for Ayelet. You touched on this briefly, but I was wondering, could you expand on the behind-the-scenes roles of women in the press? And do you see differences when looking at different ideological perspectives? For example, one might think the progressive press would be more progressive towards women, but I'm kind of pessimistic about if that is true. So I was wondering if you could expand on that.
I think that pessimism is warranted. I'll start with that. So behind the scenes, there are women working for Yiddish newspapers across the ideological spectrum from the very beginning. This is at least in part, again, a practical decision, not any ideological thing. It's so the wife of Kazriel Saracen and the children, the young children, male and female of Kazriel Saracen, helped him like set the type when he was printing his first newspapers. He was the founder of the Tageblatt, the first successful Yiddish daily, and it was Orthodox or religiously traditional, depending on how you think about it. But again, this wasn't because he felt like his wife was helping him with the editorial stuff of the newspaper, but it wasn't necessarily because he thought of her as an equal in any way or as like a productive member of the team, but because he didn't have enough people to do the actual literal work. But there was also this interesting gender dynamic at the Tageblatt. They were the first newspaper to introduce a women, not a women's page, an English page, which was in 1897. They were already realizing that the children of their readers were starting to move away from Yiddish. And so they wanted to create something that would tie their children to the Tageblatt still. And much of the actual content was being not written necessarily, but compiled by women behind the scenes. And they're not given a lot of credit for it. Yet again, we only know this because one of them happened to become famous, Rose Pastor Stokes, who was an activist, first a socialist activist and a communist activist. She got her start working for the Tageblatt's English page. And so she writes about all of the women working behind the scenes at this newspaper and how much they did not enjoy working at that newspaper. But at the same time, the same dynamics are true at the earliest socialist publications. It was usually the wives of the men who were editing these publications were contributing, in part because they were also committed socialists, but in part because they needed people to do the translation work or to do all of the other work that they needed, and just all hands were on deck. So in terms of the behind the scenes, I can talk about on the pages of the newspaper, there are a lot of complications in terms of sort of the actual ideological lines of these newspapers and what writers were actually writing, and how that relates to gender. But behind the scenes, it's this fusion of ideological understandings of what the role of news.
Thank you. I have plenty more questions, but I figured I'll do some audience ones now. And if we have time, I might ask some more. So our first audience question for Miryem-Khaye, could you talk a little bit more about the plot of Das Freiliche Bocherl and anything else we know about stagings of it? As you said, it's hard not to read the title as an oppressively broad innuendo.
Thanks for that question. I actually don't know. To be honest, a lot of Yiddish plays were never published. A lot of them were published or distributed without the author's consent or knowledge. And that's one play that I have not been able to find. So I don't know. I do know that Itzikul Vilchassenhofen was based on a play by Adam Mesko, which I just found literally like 2 days ago. It was based on another play. So I will look into that and get back to you, but I don't know. What I do know is that it's interesting that, you know, she was cast in these roles, or she chose to cast herself in these roles where using male language and using her drag persona. So that's interesting in itself. There's also Der Grüner Bocher, which Bessie Tomaszewski also performed. But at the time, it was considered pretty wild, even just to see a woman in pants. So it's interesting, those choices of words and choices of repertoire. And I would love to investigate that a little bit more and hopefully have some more information for you soon.
We'll be eagerly waiting that. So now a question for Ayelet. What do you make of those rare occasions when women were attributed? Does this signify something about their changing status or the publication itself?
Yeah, I think for me, the thing that I notice most is that the choices that editors made about when they were attributing work to women or when they were publishing work with female names often was related to some attempt to signal something about their publication, either a progressiveness or a traditionality. It depends on the newspaper, but usually the way that they framed it was that including work by women was an example of whatever newspaper they wanted to be. So a good example of this is that there's a period between about 1914 and about 1918 or so where all of the most successful Yiddish dailies include women's pages for the first time. And for each of them, what they say is basically like, this is the sort of logical next step in the newspaper, and the way that we are showing that we are a more progressive institution, a more modern institution, a more sort of popular institution, which is not the same as modern or progressive, a more American institution. So all of these things are sort of ways to signal certain things about the newspaper itself, and not necessarily saying anything real about the experience that women were having behind the scenes in terms of these publications. Does that make sense?
It's absolutely wild how the same attribution can have so many different valences according to the newspaper. It's absolutely wild. I'm going to choose a question for both of you now. I'm always curious whether the limitations women faced as creative figures in Yiddish culture are similar or different to limitations they faced in other Jewish and non-Jewish cultures in the same places and moments. Do either of you have examples or comparisons for a figure like Liedman and other women performers in other languages at the same time, and cities where Liedman performed, or women contributors to press in other languages in New York City at the time?
Well, I can start if that's okay. There were definitely other women that performed in drag. Peppy wasn't the first one to do that, and this could be in other cultures or in the Yiddish theater specifically. Just to give one example, this is a very different genre of theater, but Sarah Bernhardt was the first woman to perform Hamlet. Then Bertha Kalich was the second as a Yiddish actor. So that's one example. But yeah, I mean, there were definitely limitations. I think for Peppy, maybe it was just that, I don't want to speak for her, but I think she just found a persona that worked for her, and that instead of being, you know, an ingenue or a mother having to have like a light operatic soprano voice, she just embraced what she had and she went ahead with that. But in terms of I have to admit, I haven't done like a cross-cultural study of what was going on in other cultures at the time. I know there were other women that were, you know, doing these kind of drag performances, but I don't know enough about it to say. But in other aspects of Jewish life, I mean, there are definitely women, for example, that were basically working as cantors, and we're just starting to learn a little bit more about that, but really serving as cantors and as religious leaders of congregations decades before you know, any of the movements of Judaism that now allow women to be cantors had accepted that. So that's something that's yet to be uncovered. We know about Regina Jonas, who was basically the first woman rabbi, you know, but people were still pushing against these limitations, even though we don't hear about them, and even though maybe people don't accept that or know about it, there definitely were people that were doing this.
I'll pick up from there. The short answer is yes. There is a lot of sort of resonance between what's happening in I'll only speak for America right now, but what's happening in the American Yiddish press and what's happening in the American press in English, for example. So there's a great book that I'll cite right now called Out on Assignment by a historian and literary scholar named Alice Foss, F-A-H-S. Where she's tracing the work that women performed in the development of the American popular press in general. And there are lots of similarities in terms of sort of the patterns that we see. She's less interested in sort of the things that these newspapers are signaling with including women than what women are actually writing. But in terms of what women are actually writing, one thing that I found that's very interesting is that in both the case of the Yiddish press and the American popular press, it was very important for these newspapers to include writing by women and women's pages, but editors didn't necessarily pay particularly close attention to what women were writing because they assumed like women can't write that well, so like let them write whatever they want. So that means that women often used their columns in newspapers to either sort of subvert the ideological line of the newspaper itself, or to critique the newspaper they wrote for. And this was things that I found in my research, but it seems to have been true in the American popular press as well. There are lots of very deep, trenchant critiques of the role of women in journalism in American newspapers from the turn of the 20th century, because no one's really policing what women are writing. So you have like a little more freedom of movement, even while you're also constrained.
Next, a question for Miryem-Khaye. Any idea what the vulgarity mentioned toward the end referred to? Some kind of not so thinly veiled critique of her gender nonconformity, maybe?
Thank you. That's a great question. I've come across a couple references. For example, Mendel and Moicher's Forum actually wrote, Peppy is so beautiful and she sings so beautifully. Why does she have to make it vulgar? There's even an instance of her actually being sort of released from her contract and put on vacation because her act was so vulgar that they were afraid they would get shut down by the authorities. I don't know exactly what it was, if it was like her body language, the language she used, or the way she used the language. I do know, for example, that there's definitely a lot of innuendo in her singing style. There's actually like, in particular, there's one song, the Upbeat Chorusim, where she talks about, basically what's going to happen when the Messiah comes. All the heretics will be punished, and the pious people will celebrate at this big feast. And there's actually several different versions of the song that have become folklorized. But in one, she talks about the long Leviathan, the lange Leviosen. And Itzik Gottesman told me he thinks that's a phallic reference, actually. So that's one example. Another example from the same song is where they're having this big feast and everybody's eating these different things. And the thing that's being eaten is der Rebbetzins Hinterchelik. And it's not really clear if it's like, the Rebbetzin is eating the bottom piece of the chicken, or if other people are eating the bottom piece of the Rebbetzin. So that's just kind of an example. It's not even so much the language, but the way that it's used, the way that it's delivered.
I'm glad. The next one is for Ayelet. Is there any record of the women translators knowing each other or ever collaborating on translations?
I haven't seen a lot about collaboration, but there is lots of evidence that they knew each other. This was a relatively small world. And sometimes there was competition, but often there was a pretty good amount of sort of solidarity or attempting to support each other in these processes. So you see letters between these people behind the scenes, asking about each other, but also supporting each other's work and things like that. So a lovely example of this is in Rose Pastor Stokes' memoir. This is less about translation and more about women working as secretaries. But so she comes from Cincinnati to New York. She has had this long correspondence with the editor of the English page before she comes, and she assumes that they're going to start a romantic relationship and get married. And he forgets to pick her up at the train station, and things devolve from there. And so she has no place to stay when she gets there. And one of the other secretaries takes her in, and she lives with her and her family for her first months in New York. And like, this is a crucial lifeline for her sort of financially, but it's also that her family happens to be from a similar region of Eastern Europe to Rose Pastor Stokes' family. So she has a sense of feeling at home at the same time. And this is a figure who we would never have known about otherwise. She's not someone who writes for the newspaper, but she is also central to the development of the newspaper, if you think about it in broader terms.
Thank you. I love these small human moments that would otherwise be lost if it weren't for researchers like y'all. So I think one more question, and it seems like it's directed towards Miryem-Khaye. A question about the audience of the theater performances by drag artists. Would members of the Hasidic community of whatever gender ever have gone to see them? And if so, what was their response?
Thanks. That's a great question. Well, we do know that Peppy possibly, and a lot of the performers were from a Hasidic background. This wasn't like today. I think people that are not Hasidim might see it as this kind of, marginalized movement, but actually at one time, actually a third of Eastern European Jews were Hasidic or had a Hasidic connection. So is something very, very average. And I can't speak for another community, but what I can say is that Hasidim still go to the Yiddish theater today. And there's really a spectrum. And I'm not just talking about the Yiddish theater that's created by and for Hasidim, but also to other just general Yiddish theater that's not from a Hasidic perspective. But there's really there's a huge spectrum of like what traditional observance has meant to people. And for some, I mean, it's all about the interpretation. For example, some songs like the Apikorsim or other songs about the Messiah or anything about rabbis, some people might hear it and take it like very seriously and be like, oh, absolutely, that's absolutely right that the Rebbe can make these miracles happen. And other people might read it as a parody. So it really depends how it's presented and how it's interpreted. But definitely, I mean, there are people that would go to the theater on Shabbos that wouldn't go. It depends like how the theater was presented and how it was, you know, what kind of things were used that might have been like Shomer Shabbos or not. So it really depends, but definitely, I mean, there's some people that wouldn't have anything to do with Yiddish theater, but it's actually like a lot more nuanced than we might think.
Thank you for that very nuanced response. We have a couple minutes before Zoom is going to kick us out, so I might close with one final question. Let's see. One that might be a little more personal or on the theme of Shtumer alef. So thinking about this theme, what are some silences that you've had to work through in your work, and have you been helped by partnerships along the way?
Good question. Silences in my work. So I think the Schreiber's list is a good example that I mentioned before, the idea that there's a community of people doing this work right now in a variety of ways. This work meaning sort of trying to rethink how we talk about the history of gender in Yiddish culture. And people are very generous about how they share sources. So I think that's one sort of way of thinking about how to get around silences, is to ask a lot of questions of people and talk about your difficulties and sort of work together. And I'm trying to think of some other good silences that I am thinking about in my work. So I mean, one of the things that I struggle with is because men writing under female pseudonyms was so common in the Yiddish press, I can't assume that any byline that has a female name in the Yiddish press is the actual name of an actual woman. That's also true of the fact that like some of the women were writing for these publications under various pseudonyms. So Rosa Lebensboim, for example, when she was the editor of the Tog's women's page, she wrote under, I don't know, 5 pseudonyms, which was mostly a way to make it look like there were more people reading for these newspapers than there actually were. And so some of this is that it feels very hard to say anything definitively about a lot of these bylines, because a lot of these people we can't trace. It could be that they're real. It could be that they're people who we just don't have any archival information about, or it could be that they're completely made up people. And so that difficulty sort of persists.
Well, something that's helped me has been the help of older generations of people in the LGBTQ community that have kind of paved the way for being out and for thinking about recreating, reinterpreting language in Yiddish. So we do have these silences, like supposedly we don't have the adequate vocabulary, and I know people are working on that now. That has been a partnership of sorts, and just knowing that I have people that I can turn to and just kind of feeling like I can be creative too with my language and with how I interpret things, and also help people of a younger generation that are working on this material and might have as much experience as me. So I think it goes in a lot of different directions. Also, the Digital Yiddish Theater Project has been super helpful to me as a group of colleagues. And just like Ayelet said, I have to say, like, scholars generally have just been super generous and helpful and willing to share. So that's been really great as well.
So I want to add something to what Miryem-Khaye said, because it just sparked something for me. So I usually approach these things as a scholar, not as someone who is thinking about these in terms of personal identity. But I was talking to my students about your work, Miryem-Khaye, in preparation for this, and I was just talking about what I was doing this weekend, and I said what you were doing. And a lot of them have felt like they have to reconstruct what it means to be queer and what it means to be Jewish from scratch. And the idea that there are historical precedents of how people have navigated these issues is to them just a total revelation, and so like warmly welcome. that there are sort of historical precedents that they can pull from or argue against or think about in complicated ways. And that's a pretty wonderful thing, too, to think about the fact that what we're doing is not just reclaiming people's stories and lives, but also thinking about the various ways that people have understood how to put together all of the different aspects of identity over time and how that might be applicable today.
Thank you both so much. This is a very inspiring way to begin the conference. And I'm going to pass things back to Caleb and Sophia now, and they will tell us what is next for Farbindungen.
Thank you again to our wonderful keynote panel. Thank you, Joey, for moderating this fantastic conversation. And thank you all for being here to help us kick off Farbindungen 2024. This has been really, really incredible.
I'll just echo Sophia's thanks. This was a brilliant opening note, and I learned so much just in this last hour and a half. We just want to let folks know that we'll be taking a half-hour break now, and we'll be back at 11 for our first of our panel sessions. It's a different link, so remember to check the program to find the link for the next session at 11 a.m. And we've got so much more coming up over the next 2 days, so we can't wait to hear and learn from all of you. And thank you so much for coming out to the keynote today.